And before we move on from poverty of the stimulus, I should make two more points. The first point is to discuss what it is that connects all of these seemingly disparate phenomena together. And I think a good answer to that question goes something like this. Methodological behaviorists want to explain current behaviors on the basis of learned associations between those behaviors and eliciting stimuli in the past. However, when you observe behaviors, for instance, like language use, that are complex, variable, and highly adaptive, then you start to wonder how that robust, flexible behavioral capacity gets developed from the associations that are available to the organism prior to that specific behavior. In other words, when you compare how many different complex, variable, and highly adaptive behaviors a system may exhibit to its history of associated stimulus and response learning episodes, those episodes always seem to be impoverished for the purposes of creating this much more complex, variable, and adaptive behavioral disposition. So each of the different types of poverty of the stimulus speak to this perceived inadequacy of past experience alone to exclusively determine current behaviors, when those current behaviors are complex, they're variable, and they're highly adaptive and flexible. Finally, we should distinguish between poverty of the stimulus and Chomsky's argument from the poverty of the stimulus to his claim for universal innate grammars. Poverty of the stimulus is just a description of the relationship between the data set or the linguistic exposures that a child has and the behavioral capacities that they develop after that 7 to 10 year period. It speaks to the challenge of understanding and explaining the development of that capacity. But in and of itself, it doesn't actually dictate an answer. Chomsky's poverty of the stimulus argument is an attempt to establish a specific answer for how it is that children go from that exposure during that 7 to 10 years to this robust linguistic capacity that they manifest after that time. Chomsky wants to argue that the only way to overcome that impoverished stimulus in order to get to that robust response is by having an innate set of constraints that limit the possibilities, so that the impoverished stimulus turns out not to be impoverished when it comes to choosing between this very constrained set of possibilities. And this is certainly one way that you could get from the impoverished stimulus that we've been talking about to the robust capacity that a child exhibits. But it isn't the only way. And so we want to distinguish between descriptions of the learning task and proposed solutions or arguments for proposed solutions on the basis of the impoverishment of the initial linguistic data set. The third problem that seems to arise for the methodological behaviorists lies in that very mechanism of reinforcement. In Chomsky's discussion of Skinner's appeals to reinforcement, Chomsky suggests that Skinner makes no claims of sufficient clarity and rigor to evaluate. Now, theorists generally acknowledge that many tests, like language learning, exhibit one or more features that pose significant challenges to potential explanations based on operant conditioning and reinforcement alone. So, for instance, in language learning, children often receive no reinforcement for specific linguistic responses, either positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. They often get positive reinforcement for errors, especially when the errors are cute or judged cute by adults, to maintain a particular association developed through operant conditioning, one needs to engage in a schedule of reinforcement. And yet, linguistic behaviors really have no scheduled reinforcement. There aren't particular reinforcements for various linguistic behaviors. And finally, fourth, lots of learning just doesn't seem to fall into that model of classical or operant conditioning. So a nice example of that is one-shot learning, like the learning that I described in the text, where rats learn an aversion to a particular type of food on the basis of a single instance of that food making them nauseous. This is actually something that human beings do as well. And there are lots of examples of one-shot learning, of learning where you learn within certain modalities, but you can't learn across those modalities. Taste aversion provides us with a nice example of that. So you can learn an aversion to the particular taste of something on the basis of it making you sick. But you can't learn an association, say, between the ringing of a bell and you're becoming sick, or between the color red and you're becoming sick. There are all sorts of things that classical and operant conditioning don't speak to very well. And as Kohler and Tolman note, some learning just seems to involve insights that go beyond simple stimulus-response pairings. And finally, the fourth problem that methodological behaviorists seem to face has to do with their exclusive reliance on conditioning strength in order to determine responses. As Dewey notes and as Hull acknowledges, creatures exhibit differential responses to stimulus. For instance, a wolf is going to ignore other scents while it's stalking its prey. So what stimuli elicit in the form of a response, and when they'll elicit it, isn't just a simple linear function. Answering that question, what stimuli elicit a response and when, is much more than merely referring to a value for conditioning strength. Environment and conditioning history prove inadequate to explain complex and variable responses.